last week I talked about how Trump was using tariffs in economic policy. And I talked about how the administration wants to pass one big beautiful bill, an omnibus bill, which includes the Reciprocal Trade Act, cutting the corporate tax rate at 15% and a revenue tariff of 10% by April. And I showed that, in spite of all of the commentary otherwise, that that revenue tariff was not inflationary, adding a maximum of 0.8 of 1% to the CPI, US CPI. But this week, what we've seen is Trump use tariffs not for economic policy at all, but for social policy. And it's for to attempt to correct a social crisis in the US, which explains a lot of how Trump got elected and why Trump now has such a large following. Now, this event starts in 2000 when China enters the World Trade Organization. And what that means is it then qualifies to get its exports into the US market at most favoured nation tariffs, which are very low, of the order of 1–2%. Okay, now what then happens over a period of 10 years is the deindustrialization of the United States, where 12 million American workers lose their jobs and never get them back. And that generates a major social crisis in the United States. And this then generates the collapse of the social collapse of the working class. And that leads to enormous increase in drug dependency in the American working class. The great classic work in economics written about this was published by Nobel Prize winner Sir Angus Deaton and his wife Anne Case in 2020, and it is called The Deaths of Despair. And in that, he points out that the US overdose death rate rose from less than 20,000 before 2001 to a level of now 108,000 per year every year, okay? And young men are twice as likely to die from those drug overdoses as young women. Now, Peter Navarro, who is my go-to guy that I always quote in the administration, Peter Navarro made his career at Harvard doing research about American trade with China, which is kind of how he got in his current position. He says that 76,000 of those deaths are from fentanyl-associated drug use alone. So in the aid of social policy, what happened last week, or this week, was that Trump threatened to introduce a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada within a month, and actually did introduce a tariff on China of 10%. Now, he introduced this China of 10% in a world in which Joe Biden has already, before he left office, introduced a tax of 100% on any imported electrical vehicles from China. So this is not an area in which there hasn't been movement much larger movement by the previous administration. Okay, and the objective, as Peter Navarro says, of this, or what's been happening this week, is not a trade war, but a drug war. And it is to reduce the flow of fentanyl and fentanyl mixed drugs into the US. Okay, so in response to this threat, what has happened is Canada has pledged $1.3 billion to police its border, and Mexico has pledged 10,000 troops to patrol its border. So my bet, I'm happy to make this public, is that there ain't going to be no 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Matter of fact, I'd be extremely confident about that. Now, this fentanyl, which is the biggest majority of drugs killing people, is made in Mexico and now Canada based on component drugs coming from China. So in putting the 10% tariff on China, which was a general import tariff of 10%, which maybe presages the 10% revenue tariff that will happen in the later in the year in the omnibus bill. Now, a little bit of the history of this is that in the first term of Trump was president, he had a conference with Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping promised at that stage to reduce the flow of the basic chemicals to Mexico, which generated fentanyl, which was being imported into the US. But very interestingly, in their response to the 10% tariff this time around, China responded, fentanyl is a US problem. Hence, China is not going to cooperate in the way it promised last time. Okay, now, the question is, are US tariffs on China going to damage Australian trade with China and our exports to China? The reason I talk about this is that so many people who I think, Australian journalists who I think have been thinking entirely too hard, have said during the week that it will. So what's really important about Australian exports to China is it's really one big chunk, overwhelmingly big chunk of $84 billion a year of iron ore exports from Australia, based on the most recent number. And the question is, and that goes into to China, and we're actually going to see a significant takeoff in Chinese steel production over the next 5 months. You can actually look at the numbers. We know this because the Lunar New Year is the seasonal low and July is the seasonal high. So you're going to get a really big kick in this in this steel production in China. But we sell all this, so the question is, we would be damaged if this steel was going to the United States and would be affected by the tariff, and this would obviously affect the Australian economy. But last year we went through the data of Chinese exports of steel, and what we found, and these are based on the US numbers, that the US actually prepares these numbers, that almost no Chinese steel is exported to the United States. That the majority of it is to the Indo-Pacific. And we found last year that the biggest was Vietnam, and that was 9.9, well, it was 10% really. South Korea, 8.4, the Philippines, 5, and all the way down to India itself, which had, I think it's 3.2%. And you can go through country after country, and you get to an infinitesimal small effect of Chinese steel going to the US. So it's really hard to see how a US tariff on China is going to have any effect at all with Australian exports to China.